In this episode, we got to sit down with Lisa Cotter and talk about her new book, Reveal the Gift. But more than that, we got to talk about femininity, feminine genius. What is feminine genius? What are the gifts? How do we live that out? And so I challenge you to listen to this entire conversation because there's so much here in unpacking and revealing what is the whole womanhood thing and how do I do it? So all this and more coming up next.
Lisa, welcome to the show.
Thank you. That was a fun little intro. I've never seen that. You guys are so tech savvy. Like, we're with an interview at that was cool. I saw it. Usually that's put in post-production, but
I know.
Okay.
Well, for our listeners, we are super excited to have Lisa Cotter here on the show. She is a speaker and an author, but more importantly, a Catholic and a Catholic wife and a Catholic mom of 4 children. And we're here to talk about her new book, which we have right here, Reveal the Gift. And so, Lisa, could you tell us a little bit about the inspiration behind the book, or really why did you write the book?
Ooh, such a great question. So way back about almost 10 years ago, I was given an invitation to speak at Focus's Seek conference to all the women about authentic femininity. And I remember getting the invitation and thinking, no, no, why would you ask me to do that? Like, I don't know what to say. I feel like I'm failing at this every day. But it was an invitation. I was like, okay, Lord, fine, we'll sit and think with it. So I did. And I really got a sense on my heart of like, Lisa, I want you to do this. I don't want you to be afraid of what the church says about femininity. And that's why I had avoided the question, because I honestly was afraid that maybe what I would discover would be like, oh, wait, the role of women is actually to be submissive doormats that only make sandwiches and have babies. And so I got nervous. And I was like, oh, I don't want to know what the church says, because then I don't know what I would do. But I realized, if there's one thing that I'm going to be for the rest of my life, like always, is a woman. So if there's one thing that's worth spending time figuring out, it's maybe what it means to be a woman. What does the church say? What does this Catholic femininity thing look like? So I said yes. I dove in and I was pleasantly surprised at what I found. And that was the beginning of all of this.
What were some of the things that you found, or how has your view of femininity changed kind of over these last 10 years of exploring this topic?
Yes. Oh gosh. Yeah. It has been 10 years of exploring. So I think initially, I took kind of like some face value verses like Ephesians 5 or Genesis, right? When they talk about the helper, and I made my own interpretation of what that meant. And, kind of filled in gaps based upon some books I had read, mostly honestly by Protestants. I don't dislike Protestants, but just there wasn't a whole lot out there for me as a Catholic on what is the role of a woman, what is femininity, what does this look like. But since then, really, the works of John Paul II have been immensely life-changing for me. Seeing the way that he talks about the dignity and worth and value of all humanity, and then specifically what does that mean for a woman, has really changed my view of myself, my view of other women in my life. All of it has just brought a new sense of like joy and purpose for the gift of the genders, masculine and femininity, and how when they come together in complementary ways, just the experience that you get of humanity.
So it challenged maybe some of those initial thoughts. I think when you say the special helper, like, oh,
well,
my
little
special helper, and like challenge some of that. Maybe that the church wasn't saying, hey, you have to be a doormat and a special helper and have lots of babies and stay at home, make delicious meals. Like that is what is womanhood. And yes, that can be a way of living out womanhood, but it isn't the only path. And I think that you did a really good job in this book of presenting. I've read a lot on the feminine genius, and I was pleasantly surprised to see the gifts of woman presented in a new and different way that I think invites more people, more women to relate to them outside of maybe our fear of what they have to look like or our stereotype of what they have to look like.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, like, thank you for writing this book, mostly because you read the writings of John Paul II, and they are like, I mean, incredibly beautiful and amazing. And it's one of the things that, was instrumental in my conversion, but they're also difficult to read. I mean, he's like the St. Thomas Aquinas of like sexuality.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's really nice to have someone be able to read it, digest it, and break it down for common folk like myself.
Definitely.
Yeah, John Paul II, it's a little daunting. I think that was part of my fear too, was just like, I'm not going to be able to understand this. Like, I'm not smart enough. I don't know these philosophical terms. And that's why it's taken me 10 years to finally get the book out, because I wanted, there's so much great work out there on the feminine genius that is very practical, very like, hey, here's my experience. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's so good. I love it. And then there's so much work that's like, this is the academic side of it. Like, and you have to have a philosophy degree to be able to read this book and comprehend it. And I wanted to bring the two together. I wanted to make it accessible for any woman, because I think there's quite a bit of confusion, honestly, about what the feminine genius is when we talk about it. There's just a little bit of like, if you were to say like, hey, define the feminine genius, like most women, even those who have read about it, would be like, it's gifts. Like, like it's like, how do you define it? Right. So I wanted a book that was like really accessible for everybody to be able to read, whether you were, sorry, I'm like, all these thoughts are coming to my mind.
No,
whether you are a wife and a mother, because I think sometimes when you think about the feminine genius, it's like, well, I guess I'll live that when I have kids or when I'm married. But there's this reality of like, no, like every woman has a call to live from their feminine genius, no matter what stage of life they're in. But there wasn't a whole lot on how do I do this if I'm not married or have children or grandchildren? What am I supposed to be doing? What does that even mean if I'm not yet a wife and a mother? And so that's, you'll notice in the book, as you may have noticed, like there's not a ton on like specifically addressed to wives and mothers. It's more addressed like, hey, this is universal. This should be for any woman. Any woman should be able to live from their feminine genius, no matter what stage of life they're in. And so that's who I wrote it to, was any woman, no matter where she was at in her vocation.
So, and that was something I really liked about the book was like, how do you define femininity? How do you, it's like nailing Jello to a wall, but you did lay down some gifts, some, concrete things that are real, genuine feminine gifts that the Lord has bestowed upon women, and that frankly they're just really good at. And so, are there ones that stick out to you? Maybe in like like that one I really connect with, or ones that were like that one I might need to work on a little bit. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think the first thing I would say, I think one misconception that is important to bring up here is, so in the book, I talk about 8 different gifts that JP2 drew out. And there's a paradigm out there that I can't say is wrong, but it's not fully right. I don't know how else to say it, that there's this idea that there's 4 aspects to the feminine genius. And have you seen that before or heard that before?
Yes.
Yeah. And so I'm not like saying like, oh, people who do that are idiots. Like, no, I'm not saying that at all.
4.
Yeah. But it's important to note, like JP2 never gave us a list of gifts from the feminine genius. Like he never said there were 4 aspects. What happened is somebody wrote an article on the feminine genius, and they themselves pulled out 4 gifts that they saw. And even in the article, they made it clear that this wasn't a definitive list. But when you Google what is the feminine genius, it's one of the first things that pops up. And so people who were doing quick research were pulling that up and seeing it. And then it just kind of like slowly all of a sudden became like this, like written as like, this is gospel truth, when it's not at all. And so, yeah. So like I said, so there are more than 4 aspects to the feminine genius. There are more than 8 aspects or gifts to the feminine genius. I pulled out 8 that I saw JP2 frequently talk about when he wrote and spoke on the topic. And so those 8 are kind of what I drew from. But I also want to make it clear that even 8 isn't the right number, because there is no right number. We don't have a number. So yes, but there are certain gifts or charisms or attributes, or I mean, you can call them all kinds of things. Benedict calls them values. That you look at some of them and I'm like, oh, I'm not that. Like, how do I relate to that? Right. So yeah, I would say for me, especially earlier on, I think I've grown in this, but sensitivity was one of those words. When I would hear him talk about a woman's unique sensitivity, I'd be like, but I don't cry. So I guess I'm not very feminine, right? And like that was a story I told myself. But what I didn't realize is that I was looking at this gift from the secular point of view or the stereotypical point of view. And I thought, oh, well, sensitivity means that you have to be this like super emotional woman who's like very sensitive to other people in the sense of like if they say something mean, it makes you cry, or sensitive as in if you like watch a sappy movie, you cry. That's what I thought sensitivity was. And then I started to read what Pope St. John Paul II said and realized like, oh, that's not what he means by sensitivity. So that's where I'm talking about this misunderstanding sometimes of what the feminine genius is, because we attribute stereotypes to these words based upon our personal experiences, but that's not necessarily what JP2 is getting at. Sometimes there's a lot of overlap, but there are words where there's just a misunderstanding because we take it from the secular view, not from the JP2 view or the church view or whatever it is. So sensitivity would definitely be one of those that I got a little tripped up on. And that was why I feared like, oh, I don't know how to do this girl thing. I'm terrible at it because I'm not girly girl who cries a lot.
Yeah. I think that's totally fair and something I can very much relate to in learning how to be a woman.
You mean being a woman in the Air Force? They don't teach you.
Yeah, no, there's definitely be more like a man attitude in it, which is not coming from a place of even like sexism. It's coming from a place of that's how the Air Force has done business for its entire experience. And then women come in around the 80s and all of a sudden, like, how does a woman lead in that environment and what does that look like? And so there's just some learning curve there. Yeah. So sensitivity was not a thing. But for our viewers, I did want to list the 8 that you pulled out. So you listed self-giving, receptivity, maternal, sensitive, intuitive, generous, faithful, and strong. And I think that's such a powerful list, but what stood out really in this book was again how you took each one of these gifts and presented them in a different way, because there is a part of me that goes, okay, well, yeah, I can see all of that in my motherhood, or I have seen how these have been twisted, which in every chapter you have a section of how they are twisted, and how my own wounds, my own experiences with women have tainted these or influenced the way I receive them or how I have learned to express them. And so I do think that there is a lot of healing available in this book, especially if those words feel hard. Or if you feel like you don't measure up, or that women don't measure up in that way, or haven't in your life for you. Yeah, just a different way to approach them, which I think was really good. In that, one of our favorite parts of the book is your storytelling. Your storytelling is incredible and just invites you in such a powerful way. And we joked with each other that maybe it's because so you tell a story of each gift of a woman or a gift of women who lives this out. And we joked with each other that maybe these saints are connecting with us because a lot of the stories we tell right now are like 5-year-old, 3-year-old, 1-year-old level, which is just a very different, Elizabeth Ann Seton taught children. Like,
That's right.
all of her life experience, we're not going to get into. Dorothy Day, like, oh, she like served the poor. Like, okay, like a very, very G. And their lives were not that. Their lives involved suffering, and they involved loss, and they involved hardships, and they involved realness, which gives me hope. And so thank you for capturing that, and for capturing some different women, because in generosity, you said, well, the first saint that comes to mind is Mother Teresa, but like, we all know and love her. So let's talk about somebody totally different. And you presented a saint, a servant of God that I have never heard of. And just that opportunity to expand, what does holiness look like? Again, what does womanhood look like? What does holiness look like? We can have sometimes a tainted view. I don't know if you can pick one, but what was one of your favorite women to write about in the book?
Oh, that is such a hard question. It was I spent like a month with each of them because my goal really was to read their story and find the gems. Like find those deeper pieces that are not in the short little bios. Those pieces where you go, "Ooh, that's what made her tick," or "That's where her heart lied," or "That's where her wounds were." I wanted to see like the experience of the woman, not just the like picture on the holy card, where you're like so I guess, so I spent like a month with each of them. And of course, that was always my favorite saint, whoever I was learning about, or group of women,
Yeah.
right? Because some of them are groups of women, like the women of the French Revolution or the women at the foot of the cross. And so, I mean, the first person that comes to mind, though, honestly, is Elizabeth Ann Seton. And I think because when we look at her, we think of her as like this bonnet wearing school marm who was like frumpy and had a ruler and was like super disciplined and strict. And then you read her like real story and you understand her life and where she came from. And you realize like, yeah, we should probably rebrand her. Like that's not super accurate. So yeah, like you were talking about like the G side, right? So Elizabeth Ann Seton, just to give a little taste of her life, she was born Protestant, right? She loses her mom as a young child, and her father eventually remarries this woman who completely rejects her and her little sister, or older sister. And her father's this workaholic, right? Who I'm like, he's like the Dr. Fauci of the time, basically, is the way you describe him. Like there was this pandemic going on that they couldn't figure out. And he was the health department of New York. And so he was, constantly working and just very like cold to his new wife who was having lots of babies for him. And so she grows up like without her biological mother. She grows up with this cold mother who is her stepmother, and then her stepmother has an opiate addiction because she can access it because her dad is a doctor, or her husband's a doctor. And so both she and her older sister very likely we can't like hard proof this, but like very likely had this addiction. And so she grows up just like in this turbulent home, right? Like and we know her as Mother Seton, and like she is like the epitome of motherhood in the way we talk about her. But like you don't realize like she grew up without an example of what a mother should look like. Yet she learned and she embraced, right, this gift of maternity, which is given to every woman, whether or not she physically bears children or not. Right? There's physical motherhood and spiritual motherhood, which JPII frequently talks about, because we have, right, this capacity as women to bear children. Therefore, we have the capacity to mother, because whether or not it's, fully exercised in the physical way or not, we need that. And so you see that in her life. She does become a physical mother. She becomes an adoptive mother. Most people don't know that part of her story. I'll let you read the book to get to that, because I could go on. And then she's this spiritual mother to all the children that she educates. And then she's mother superior of her religious order that she founds, which is this whole new idea for the church, because she was a widow with children, yet she felt this call to give herself to God wholly as a religious sister. And so there's just like her whole story, right? I love it.
Yes. Oh, there's so much there.
Yes.
And I think it's really inspiring for our listeners who didn't have a lot of this like authentic femininity or these gifts modeled for them, to know that no, there are like saints, there are people in heaven right now who also did not have this model to them. And they, through the grace of God, through learning, through reading, through self-introspection, were able to capture and embody these things. Just to spread the word of God, to take care of children, to make the world a better place, all of it. But I was thinking too, so did you have any concerns about writing this book now? Because I feel like 10 years ago, there wasn't a lot of controversy or things about femininity and identity and all of these things, right? And now that we're surfacing, it's kind of a hot topic in our culture right now. And so I don't know, what are your thoughts on kind of what's going on with femininity? Because you lay out a couple different eras of, hey, what is femininity? What was it supposed to look like in the 50s and in the 80s and different things? But I think there's kind of, it's been hijacked again almost in our society. And so I'm curious at your thoughts of like your book and the culture today.
I know. It's so interesting, isn't it? Because here I gave this talk for the first time in 2013 and had this, desire to write this book for a long time. But God put another book on my heart and he was like, this one's first. That's Dating Detox, the one I wrote with my husband. And then I, got like this like feeling of like, yep, now's the time. But it was like a couple years ago that I was like, okay, here we go. We're diving into this topic now, over 2 years ago. And then so much has changed in the landscape of my process of writing it, right? I was like, wow, Lord, like, yeah. But not only do we have this one side of the secular world that's looking at femininity from one lens, but even within our church, without naming names or titles, there's also some questions about, on this other side. So the church is saying gender has no purpose, no meaning, or sorry, secular world is saying gender has no purpose, no meaning. There's nothing to this. It's mere biological. Whereas on the other side, even within the church, there's some circles that are saying, no, a woman's place is actually, complete submission to her husband, making sandwiches and having babies, and that's it. It's like, wow, okay, so here's my book coming out in the middle of this storm where people I think are really genuinely asking, okay, so what is going on here? Like, who am I supposed to be listening to? What voice am I supposed to be listening to? And I think what's beautiful about the book is like, nothing in here is not nothing, but very little in here is my original thought. And I'm okay with that. It's the words of Pope St. John Paul II. It's the teachings of the church. It's the teachings of Genesis from the beginning, right? Like what was God's original intention and plan? That's what before fall, right? We have to do this as pre-fall, because post-fall, that's when things got twisted really badly. But what was God's original plan for woman? And that tells us something about who we are and who we were created to be. And so I think there's a beauty in that God knows, right? And like in his perfection. And yeah, there's a little bit of me that's like, oh, well, I guess I can never run for office now because I'd get canceled in a second. But I was going to pursue a political career anyway. So, we're good. But I just want like the beauty and the truth to come out. And it's even hard to capture here in this quick podcast, because I know there's some people who are listening maybe and they're hearing like, oh, so she's like this like liberal feminist. And there's other people going, oh, so she's this hyper conservative who thinks that, and I'm like, no, I'm neither of those actually. Like, I'm Orthodox. I'm for the church. And I want to bring out the church. What does the church teach? And it's beautiful when you dive into it and when you read it. And then I wanted to bring the lives of the saints alongside to make it come alive. So it's not just these, heady thoughts, but like, no, what does this look like lived out? Like, show me how to do this. Show me where I'm wounded in this area and help me. That's kind of the last piece of each chapter, right? Not only is where does it get twisted, but what do we do about it? How do we fix it? Show me, how do I live from this gift? Because God knows you better than you know yourself, right? He's the one who created you, and he knows like what's going to make you peaceful, joyful, and fulfilled in this life. And there's a way of expressing humanity that's called feminine. And there's a unique way to do that in a way that will bring peace. It's not in a tight box. Okay. That's, I think, the fear is that people think, well, it's just one way to do this. But when you look at the lives of the saints, oh my gosh, in every time, place, nation, tongue, race, there is women who have been raised up as saints. And so there is so much room to live and breathe the way in which you express your unique individual personality, the way in which you live from your feminine nature, that is so freeing. And that's what I want women to experience from this book.
Something you said, I think I've just been praying about a lot of, everyone's really trying to make sense of our times, of what's going on right now. And there paints a picture that you're either on like the far left, you're on the far right, or you're just like a lame duck in the middle who's lukewarm. And I think that's not true. Like there's, you can have this radical orthodoxy to be centered in Christ. And I think when you read that, you dive into the teachings of the church, of the saints, of the popes, you can realize that you don't have to land on this political spectrum. Like you can be like centered on Christ and be radical about that. And so I think that was just something that I appreciate about the book is this authenticity in the teachings of the church, and just the beauty of that, and how that we can live that and be saints.
And I think it's really important to acknowledge that there is this twisting that occurs, but the reality that God made you, as you said, for this world, and your unique gifts, the way that you live out these gifts is needed and important. And as John Paul II says, like, it is for all of society. Like, society needs women in all aspects, at home, in the public life, in the like all of it. And they need these gifts. And men, I think one of the other things that you highlight is that it's not that men don't have these gifts, but that women have them in a specific way and serve as an example of them. And so it's only when we are healed that we are good examples of them too. And so maybe there's some healing that needs to happen in each one of these and some growth that needs to happen. And practically, there's a ton in the book. Also, at the end of each chapter is the challenge, and then Drew loves the appendix.
Yeah, I'm a pilot, so like the checklist or like appendix, like here's your list of ways to work on things. I dig it.
It's all about it, all about the practical, how to Catholic.
Yes. That's right. That was our podcast. That's right. Oh, I miss this. I'm so glad you brought that up, though. That you think that is so important to recognize too. There's just like so many pieces. I feel like to get the complete picture, you have to read the whole book. You got to read the book. I know. I'm not like trying to push it in that way, but like it always makes me a little nervous that someone's going to hear one snippet and then be like, "Oh, so she said this," and it's like, no. Like you. This is not a simple answer. Like what is femininity? That's not a simple. Oh, it's this. Like that's a hard question to answer unless you understand. Like there's a whole picture that you need to be able to see it fully. So I think one of the aspects that I think is so important that you just brought up is it's Pope Benedict, who, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger working under JPII in I guess the CDC office in his role, right, who talked about this idea that, like women have these unique gifts that they are the privileged sign of, is what he said. He called them values, right? The privileged sign. And he says the reason is because women are more naturally inclined to these gifts, but it's their job to bring them and model them into the world. So, right, it's not that men are not called to be generous. It's not that men are not called to be sensitive. It's that they're called to do it in their own unique masculine way. And the way in which women express it and men express it, it's similar, but there's something about the way that we have been created. Our bodies, right, reveal something about us that is written on our soul, and we bring that into the world, and we express that in complementary ways that are vital, right, to both church and society.
Yeah. And in this book, there's science, there's everything. Yes, it is the full picture. It's the theology, the brain science, the body, the way that we are created, all of these different elements tied together to get the fullness of it. What are some practical things that you would want to highlight? We talked that they're in the book, but are there any that you would want to bring to women to help them grow in their feminine genius?
I think it's really important to ask yourself, like, who am I listening to? Who is teaching me about who I am? Who is my, professor when it comes to gender? Because if it's the world, then I fear that you're going to be disappointed because, Drew, you kind of mentioned this. We go through looking at the different decades previous to now. And to give like a quick overview, right? In the 1950s, to be a woman, you were like the domestic goddess, right? You knew how to cook, you knew how to clean, you stayed home, you cared for the children. That was what the world said it meant to be a woman. Okay. Now I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's the reality, right? And then we hit the 60s and 70s. And to be a woman meant that you were totally good with the idea of just go with the flow, sexual evolution, free love, right? There was just this idea that like you were just along for the ride, and you weren't concerned about really much in terms of like your feelings, your thoughts. It was just like, let go of your inhibitions, right? Allow yourself to be objectified. That's what it means to be a woman. You're cool with being objectified. Then we hit the 80s and 90s, and it's like, hey, to be a woman means you assert yourself like a man. Right? If you grew up in the 80s and 90s, or if you've seen, any pictures from the 80s and 90s, like there was this big push of like, hey, let's just like become manly as women, right? So the times are constantly changing is what that shows us. It shows us that in every decade or every 15, 20 years, we change what we think femininity is and what it means to be a woman. And so what we see right now and what the world is saying right now means to be a woman, I without saying anything pro or against it, what I can tell you is it's going to change. So if you put your stock in that, you're going to have to change who you are and your opinions and your thoughts every 15 to 20 years if you want to keep up with what the world is telling you you're supposed to be. And that's just exhausting. And so that's why I say, let's go to the beginning. Let's go to the unchanging. The church, and obviously the way it speaks about femininity changes based upon the culture and time too, but at its foundations, the church has always affirmed women have worth, value, and dignity that is equal to man's. That has never been questioned, right? That has always been the foundation, right? The church has always said that the masculine and the feminine, they complement each other, right? These key words in scripture that kind of bother us, like helper or wives be submissive to your husband, right? Like there's a mutuality to that. If you understand what Paul was saying, if you understand what the teaching was saying, that I think has been missed, even in Catholic circles sometimes, that we were created to mutually help each other. We were created to mutually submit to each other. But what does that look like, right? So these are all the things that are explored in the book. Maybe not.
I think that's such an important.
I don't dive into Ephesians 5 as much because I wanted to make it something that was accessible no matter what stage of life you're in, and that's more specific to the married state. So
yeah. I think that that's fair. And I appreciate that, although Ephesians 5 is one of my favorites, now that I understand the fullness of it and the challenge that's there for men to like lay down their lives. For me, I'll take that. I'll take that one. But the aspect of just, there's something about what you were saying for women as they dive into this, the healing that is available of that full picture, with that idea that, again, we don't want somebody to take a snippet of this conversation. But in today's era, one of the things that I most see is this comparison. And we do it with society at large or with the Catholic world. Like I either have too many kids and they were too early in my marriage, or I have too few kids and it's too late in my marriage, depending on like what you want to do with that, and you make the joke of like, do I have the right planner? Do I have the right, shirt or coffee mug or, whatever it is, because of our Instagram view and our social media in general. I think it's really easy to enter into this comparison, and again to acknowledge that we are called to live out these gifts in our own unique way, that you were created with a purpose in the gender that you are, but also that you are going to live that out in a beautiful, radical way that the world needs. And so thank you for fleshing out a different way to live out these gifts in making them accessible and real and not just the pretty Instagram picture that makes me feel like a failure. So thank you for that. Where else can people find more out about you, about Reveal the Gift?
Yeah, so I am on Instagram. Yep.
Yes. Are we?
Just talking about that comparison thing. Yeah, you do have to be careful though. Yeah, it is true. You can easily sum up like your life and compare it to the squares of somebody else's, and that's not always authentic, right? But I am at Lisa Ann Cotter, and it's Ann with no E. And then the book itself you can get at, there's a whole page that it's nice. They made a cute little address for me. It's ascensionpress.com/revealthegift. So super simple, easy to remember, ascensionpress.com/revealthegift. And then it'll take you to everything that you need to be able to purchase the book. It's available as an ebook as well, so you can get the Kindle edition there. And then eventually it'll be up on Amazon. I don't know what's going on with it right now, but it is perpetually, temporarily out of stock. So I can't figure Amazon out. They're so confusing.
Maybe that means it's getting all bought up.
Also, that it's so good that the spiritual warfare against it is
your book
solid.
That's right. One of those two. I don't fully know. Tried reaching out. I don't even know. So one day it'll be available on Amazon, but you can always get it there. And then ask your local Catholic bookshops. I love
Yeah.
supporting local
Yeah.
Catholic bookshops. Ask them, if they
Mm.
don't carry it, if they would get a copy for you, support them.
That's awesome.
That'd be great.
Yeah,
Mm.
that's so good. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. Again, for all of our listeners, we'll leave links in the description for the book and for Lisa's social handles that you guys can check all of that out. I highly recommend it for women. I highly recommend it for men to get a glimpse into the feminine genius. And so, with all that, thank you so much. I hope that this interview helped you as our listeners grow in your faith like never before. And Lisa, again, thank you. We are praying for you and for your family and for your ministry and for the book. So God bless.
Thank you.